Hello everybody, if you've clicked on today's video, for which I thank you, chances are, like myself, you're a bit of a Jag fan. However, it is sadly impossible to deny the fact that the company does seem to be in a lot of trouble. Their model lineup is becoming increasingly sparse, and those which remain are getting on now. It is also now ever more apparent that their electric revolution is having a little bit of trouble getting out of the starting gate, and it feels like the firm is only one minor corporate restructuring away from becoming a trim level for Land Rover. And if that were to be the case, I think it would be a tragedy, not just for Britain as a whole, but also for car fans across the world. Jaguar is a brand with an amazingly rich heritage of both road and race cars, but even more than that, only 20 years ago it seemed to be in its strongest position yet, ready to take on the 21st century with a renewed vigour. How then have Jaguar managed this in 2 decades to go from being at their absolute best to the point of near extinction? Well, I've been giving this a lot of thought recently, and I believe you can trace the beginning of Jaguar's downfall to the release of this, the XType. But was it really that bad? And what did Jaguar actually do wrong anyway? Well, that's complicated. So let's begin by talking about what the XType actually is. I'm going to discuss the car in isolation, and then we will get on to the topic at hand, what exactly went wrong and how it really has contributed to the downfall of Jaguar, and why I think actually this is a lesson that many other companies out there really need to pay close attention to. So, the XType was one of the first cars launched by Jaguar under the stewardship of Ford when it was part of what they called their Premier Automotive Group. This was an association that ran essentially from the late 90s to the late noughties, and it included not just Jaguar, but also Volvo, Aston Martin and Land Rover. It was under Ford's ownership that Jaguar and Land Rover were essentially bolted together, and this is a topic I'm going to revisit in a little bit, because it's very important. Now, by this point, Ford had actually been involved with Jaguar for quite some time, having first showed an interest in the company in the 1980s. Come the 1990s, and it was a more formal relationship, and the money had started flowing. The first fruit of this relationship was the revised XJ, dubbed the X300. It was essentially an evolution of the XJ40 platform, but with all the bugs kind of ironed out, and the investment given to it that it really should have had in the first place. Ford, it seemed, was certainly very happy in the early days to splash the cash, spending money on upgrading facilities, giving Jaguar newer, more modern production techniques in order for them to be a more successful business. All well and good. The first brand new car came in the late 90s in the form of the very retro-styled S-Type, which, though it did divide opinion in terms of looks, was actually a very good car indeed, and one that I actually have a real soft spot for on account of the fact that my dad had one. Shamefully, I talked him out of an XJR into the S-Type, and I'll never live that down, but anyway. Then next up was the X-Type, and this really was where things got a little bit interesting, because Ford decided that Jaguar had to sell more cars. A lot more cars. Their aim was to double the output of the firm, and the X-Type is how they were going to do it. And this was a big deal because it was the first time Jaguar were going to that part of the market, competing directly with fleet favourites like the BMW 3 Series, the Audi A4 and the Mercedes C-Class, as well as no doubt the odd Vauxhall and Ford here and there. One of the reasons that I'm particularly glad to be driving this exact car is that it shows you what a mixed up cookie an early X-Type was. I have previously experienced the platform before, but that was a later 2005 with the diesel engine. This shows you what exactly buyers were faced with when the car was launched in sort of 2001 up until about 2003. In some ways, you can very clearly see that Jaguar were trying to produce something a little more cost-conscious. So you have a fabric interior and, unbelievably, windy windows in the back too. I must also say I am extremely impressed by the condition of this particular car. Many X-Types out there, on account of the fact they've been cheap for so long, aren't all that great, but this one is spectacular. Mantis has done a little bit of work to the car, replaced the drive belt, renewed a few things, sorted a little bit of paintwork, so on and so forth, but generally speaking, it's as he got it. And the reason for the condition? Well, it's on just 45,000 miles, but more than that, until he got it, it had had just one owner for 21 years. and it really does feel like a car that's been owned and loved from new. And you can also see plenty of areas where Jaguar really did put the effort in to make sure this still felt like a more upmarket car. So you have air conditioning, you have a CD changer, you've got real wood veneers, and a very plush ride. This car really does feel like a Jag should. It's comfortable, beautifully damped. No, not quite as sophisticated as some others, but you got to remember, it was an entry-level model for the firm made 2 decades ago. Even so, in 2023, this is a lovely thing. But there were still a couple of key issues with the X-Type, the early ones in particular, that showed you just how little experience Jaguar had in the segment. Of course, just about any pub ball worth their salt will be keen to tell you when you mention an X-Type that it is just a Mondeo in a fancy frock. But the fact is, that's not really true at all. Yes, it's spun off the same platform that gave us the 3rd generation Mondeo, but first off, that's a really good car, and secondly, so much re-engineering went into this that by the time it was done, only 19% of parts were actually shared between the two, and the majority of those were things under the skin that you'd never see anyway and would have been utterly daft for Jaguar to have come up with themselves. So I don't really think that's a problem. But in order to try and distance itself from the likes of Ford, Jaguar decided that the car at launch would come exclusively with a V6 petrol engine and all-wheel drive. I reckon the latter was on account of the fact that by default this is a front-wheel drive platform, and later on when Jaguar did a 2-wheel drive variant of the car, it was front-wheel drive. That would have almost certainly ruled out any potential BMW or Mercedes owner from wanting one, and is likely why Jaguar were so keen to develop their all-wheel drive system, and more than that, give it a slightly rearward bias. By default, this car sends 60% of its torque to the rear wheels. The V6 bit, though, is the trickier one. Up until this point, Jaguar had chiefly been using either 6 or 8 cylinders, so the presence of a 6 in the car wasn't really anything unusual at all. But in this segment in Europe, a 6-cylinder would certainly have been considered a premium engine option, with the vast majority of buyers going for either a 4 or a diesel, neither of which Jaguar offered you for the first few years. In fact, the car never received a 4-cylinder petrol. It wasn't until 2003 it got a diesel of any description, and bizarrely, it wasn't until 2008, just a year before the car was discontinued, you could have actually had your diesel with an automatic. And that to me shows that they ignored one enormous and crucially important audience for this car: fleet buyers. Any car in this segment 20 years ago had to appeal not just to individuals, but companies as well. And whilst the person who works at a company might want themselves a Jag, the fact is, if you're doing a lot of miles, an automatic is a nice thing to have, and if you can't make the numbers on paper work, the person who controls the cash isn't going to let you have one. And that almost certainly contributed to why Jaguar sold just 350,000 of them over 8 years, as opposed to the 800,000 that they had predicted. But in spite of all that, it was still Jaguar's biggest selling car to date. Why then is it today considered a massive failure? Is it because it was a bad car? Well, no. You only need to look at the reviews of it in period to find that actually the people who drove it really liked it. And even in 2023, right here, right now, I'll happily tell you, there are a lot of reasons to buy yourself an X-Type. Mantis is actually a relatively new driver. He's 29 but didn't get his license until fairly recently. His first car was an R56 Mini, which he still has, but he decided he wanted something a little more luxurious. He'd actually spotted an X-Type a few years before and thought, wow, that's a nice looking proper Jaguar, but then saw the prices and thought, well, there must be something wrong with them. When he'd got his license and wanted something a little nicer for himself, he thought, you know what, I'll look into that Jaguar again, and he read the reviews and, like I did, came to the conclusion that, well, they seem pretty decent. He is presently very happy with his purchase, and despite having to get used to the size of it, it's got only rear parking sensors, not front, he's really been enjoying it. This car has the 2.5 litre version of the Ford-derived V6, which has some Jaguar-specific things, like variable valve timing. You could have also got it in a 3 litre, where it made 231 horsepower, but here it still makes a reasonable 193. That figure does stick in my head, because I seem to recall many BMWs of the time making exactly the same, and I think it was a German insurance thing, or something weird like that. Torque is 180 pound-foot, the gearbox I've already discussed and is lovely, but you could also have these with a manual, and if you do fancy a modern Jaguar where you can roll your own gears, the XType is really one of your very few options. The steering is typical Jaguar, has a little bit of weight to it, but is still on the light side. Talks to you though, you've got a very good idea of what the chassis is doing, and though it's not exactly a mountain goat or agile like a terrier, it's still a fine thing to hustle down a road such as this. Really does feel like a Jag. So what's the problem then? Well, I think it's a philosophical one. This car is to me perhaps the prime example of how easy it is to get something wrong when you're trying to build a group of companies. In isolation, this car is perfectly fine. But the sort of person who would want a Jag is more likely to have wanted an XJ or perhaps an S-Type. And the sort of person who wants a more affordable, more economical car isn't going to want to put up with a V6. Jaguar's idea, by the way, of trying to economise it was to introduce a 2.1 litre version that it won't surprise you to hear drinks, I think, just as much as this, which is already not great at sort of high 20s mpg. We're not exactly sure, there isn't really much of a trip computer in here. Well, any sort of trip computer really, barring the usual distance counter. I think the only company in history which has really semi-successfully managed to get a stack of brands that are still fairly close together to make sense is VW. We all know the hierarchy. You've got your Seat and Skoda here, you've got VW here, Audi here, Bentley, Porsche, Lamborghini and Bugatti. It all makes sense, and the cars still sell, despite the fact that we know they're quite related. Having this share some of its parts with a Mondeo, I think didn't do it any favours whatsoever, because in Britain and in the USA, VW is considered a fairly premium brand. So when you say your Audi shares parts with a Golf, it's not really much of an issue. But to say your Jag has Ford underpinnings, that I think is problematic in the heads of many people. And from my perspective, if you want a cheaper car, why don't you just buy the Mondeo? Surely that's the sensible thing to do. And this, I think, is really a big issue that we're all facing now. You see, 20, 30 years ago, you went to the brand based on the type of car that you needed. So, for example, if you wanted yourself a luxurious saloon, you'd go to Jaguar, Lexus, BMW, Mercedes, or the like. If you wanted yourself a fun, sporty little hatchback, it would be a Ford or a Vauxhall. If you wanted yourself an off-roader, you'd go to Land Rover or, say, Toyota for a cruiser. But in the last few years, the world has gone nuts for not just hatchbacks, but more specifically SUVs. And by Jaguar being bolted to the side of Land Rover, it's created a bit of a problem. On the one hand, you'd have thought this was absolute gold, because they've got access to what are considered some of the best 4x4s in the world. However, they've never really capitalised upon that. I expect part of it is going to be a protectionist policy on the part of Land Rover, but the fact is, the Land Rover and Range Rover brands have become known for making that kind of car. The two companies being related also meant that in many cases their dealerships were on the same sites, if not even in the same building. So if you were looking for an SUV and thought about a Jaguar, chances are you'd wind up looking at a Range Rover anyway. In recent reports, JLR admitted that it was the new Defender and Range Rover lines that were really pushing sales. Presently, Land Rover products outsell Jaguar by a margin of around 5-1, clearly unsustainable. And it does not take long before the spiral of reducing budgets and cutting quality to make up for that loss comes in, and that's a terminal process which is almost irreversible. Jaguar, meanwhile, are known for saloons. The fact is, saloons just aren't in vogue. They did, however, manage to have quite some success with the XK and latterly the F-Type, which I think did brilliantly for the company, not just in terms of sales, but also image. Why then has the F-Type not been given an immediate electric successor? Maybe it will soon, but really, it should have been out already. Take the wind out of Porsche's sails with the new electric Boxster. Give us something exciting with a Jaguar badge on that we can buy. And I think the problem that Jaguar had under their Ford ownership is that the only way companies like Ford can think is big. As far as they're concerned, success is more cars, more money, more profit margins. It's just not a good way for certain companies to do business. Why do you think Ferrari don't tell people how many cars they make anymore? It's because they don't want to admit it's more than they used to. They maintain the illusion of Ferraris being a relatively scarce thing. It's how they make sure they're still perceived as being special. And that, to me, is how Jaguar should be. If it doesn't have to stand on its own 2 feet, if it can be part of a larger company, Ford, Tata, or whoever the hell wants to own it, let Jaguar be the arm that's there to make nice, luxurious things. The arm that doesn't really have to make too much money, but does its own thing. It makes the products feel more special, and therefore allows you to ask more money for them. And this is important because with a company like Jaguar, it should be about profit margins and not sales numbers. Sadly, Ford, I'm not sure really have ever thought that way. It actually took a whole 5 years for this car to get a successor at all, which arrived in the form of the XE, and in some ways I think they actually made the opposite mistakes. The car was in some ways much more advanced, had a new aluminium architecture, was a very, very cool thing, but very soon in, they discontinued the V6 engine, leaving you with only a turbocharged 4-cylinder as the top of the line. And who wants that in a Jag? Nobody. The company really heavily invested in both the Chinese market and diesel, which 10 years ago looked like the sensible bets. Unfortunately, neither turned out to be that way, and they're really, really paying the price for it. What they're going to do about it, I really don't know, and in some ways, actually Jaguar just becoming a trim for Land Rover is probably the most sensible way of keeping the brand alive. It is also the last thing that myself and just about any other card-carrying petrolhead would want to see. The lesson for other companies to learn? Well, it's a big one, and I'm currently seeing it happening over at Stellantis, where it would appear that they're insisting on every single company under their brand having an SUV of some description. Case in point, Maserati. The last 2 cars they've announced are the MC20 supercar, which is over £200,000, £300,000 if you go nuts and want the drop-top version, and the Grecale. As far as I'm concerned, Maserati should be Stellantis' version of Jaguar. It should make nice, luxurious, high-end cars, and not many of them. Instead, of what I'm currently seeing nearly across the board is a whole bunch of manufacturers all racing to make exactly the same car. And it seems unfortunate that just about every car company under the sun, with very, very few exceptions, seems happy to chuck out the family silverware and burn their heritage in the pursuit of sales. And I think that is a real tragedy, because the one thing I'm really, really trying to fight against, what little good I can do, is the car as a white good. And I'm sure you've all seen that meme floating about of, oh look, all cars are the same, aren't they? Which I think is a little bit misleading. But in any case, I don't want all cars to be the same, and I don't want all manufacturers to make the same things. And when they're all individual, I could kind of understand them all wanting a piece of the same pie. But they're not. They're part of bigger entities, so use it. Do proper brand work. Make a badge mean something again. Please, please. I don't want a cheap Maserati any more than I want a really expensive Fiat. It's just not how it works. There's a reason that BMW have Mini and Rolls-Royce, because they know they can't charge Rolls-Royce money for a BMW, and they don't want to sell a BMW for Mini money. And it's that thinking which, unfortunately, hasn't really done Jaguar any favours at all. If you know the history of the company, you'll know it never really sold that many cars. It never really did financially that well. But it built an image. And if it loses that, it really won't have anything. So that's a half review, half talk, half rant. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, please hop into the comment section down below and tell me. I want to say a big thanks to Mantis for bringing his car out, and as ever, to you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, and subscribe if you haven't already. Bye-bye.